The ocean has always been spoken of in grand terms. People describe it as vast, mysterious, dangerous, or beautiful. They imagine storms and monsters, brave sailors and daring voyages. Yet for most of history, for most of the ordinary people who lived alongside it or upon it, the ocean was none of those things. It was dull. It was repetitive. It was the same sound, the same sight, the same smell, over and over again. If you were a fisherman, a sailor, or even a clerk sitting in a harbor office, the ocean was not an adventure. It was a backdrop of endless monotony, a stage where nothing changed, and where your own life was spent. Repeating the same actions every day. Picture yourself on the edge of a medieval coastal village. It is evening. The sea stretches before you, dark and calm, reflecting a pale moon. The air is cool, filled with the faint temps of salt and the distant cry of gulls. Fishermen drag nets across the sand, their shoulders bent, their steps slow. They have done this every evening of their lives, and their fathers before them did the same. There is no drama here, no excitement, just repetition. Nets laid out, nets pulled in, the smell of fish, the weight of water, the rhythm of waves. The ocean itself gives little variety. At night, you hear waves break against the shore. By morning, you hear them again. They do not change. Each one sounds the same, a dull rushing noise that could be from today, yesterday, or 100 years ago. The gulls cry overhead, circling in endless loops. The boats creak as they rock against their moor. The sounds form a background hum that never stops, never surprises, never lifts the spirit. To live by the ocean is to live with this sameness pressing on your ears, day and night. Even the sight of the sea, vast though it is, becomes ordinary. At first it may seem beautiful, the sparkle of sun on water, the long line of horizon, but look at it every day for years, and the beauty fades into dullness. The horizon is always there, always the same distance away, always unreachable. The color of the water shifts slightly with the light, but it is still water. The waves roll endlessly, each one like the last. A sailor at sea might stare at that flat horizon for weeks without seeing anything new. For him, the ocean is not beauty, but boredom. The smell of the ocean carries its own monotony. Salt lingers in the air, soaking into clothes, hair, and skin. At first it may feel fresh, even invigorating, but over time it becomes a constant presence, impossible to escape. Salt on the wind, salt on your lips, salt in your breath, combined with the smell of fish and tar, it settles into your senses until you no longer notice it unless you leave, and only then realize how heavy it had been. This is the dull ocean, the one that most people knew, not the ocean of legends or stories, but the ocean of daily life. To the fisherman, it was a workplace, nothing more. To the sailor, it was a road that stretched too long, without milestones or turns. To the clerk, it was a column in a ledger, ship in, ship out, cargo recorded. The ocean was vast, but its vastness contained little variety for those who had to endure it. Imagine the fisherman again. He rises before dawn, when the sky is still black, and the sea is a shadow against the stars. He takes his place in the boat, feels the same rocking under his feet, hears the same splash of oars. He casts his net. He waits. He pulls it in. Perhaps he catches something, perhaps not. But tomorrow he will do it again, and the next day, and the next. The net becomes an extension of his arms, the boat an extension of his body. The actions blur together until he cannot remember one day from another. The ocean is not adventure. It is routine. The sailor's life is no different. He boards his ship, stows his gear, ties the same knots he has tied 1,000 times before. He watches the same horizon, eats the same salted fish, sleeps in the same cramped corner of the deck. Days pass, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. The ocean offers him no variety, only time stretched into sameness. His life becomes a series of waits, waiting for wind, waiting for land, waiting for cargo to be loaded or unloaded. Adventure belongs to stories told in taverns, not to the man stuck on a becalmed ship in the middle of the sea. Even the clerk at the harbor feels this monotony. He sits at his desk, quill in hand, and records the same details: the name of the ship, the weight of the cargo, the names of the crew. He scratches the words into parchment, line after line, day after day. Outside, he hears the ocean, smells the salt, sees the masts rise above the water, but none of it changes the dullness of his task. He does not marvel at the sea. He does not write about its beauty. He writes, 10 barrels salted fish, 2 crates wool cloth. Ship departed. The ocean for him is ink and numbers, lists and tallies. And yet, there is a strange comfort in this monotony. The sameness of the sea is also its stability. Waves may rise and fall, storms may come and go, but the ocean always returns to its rhythm. For the people who lived by it, that rhythm became the heartbeat of their lives. They knew what to expect. They knew what tomorrow would bring. There was no surprise, no drama, only the steady flow of work and water. It was boring, yes, but it was also dependable. As you listen to this story, you may find your own breathing begin to match that rhythm. The waves rise, the waves fall. The fisherman pulls his net, the sailor ties his knot, the clerk writes his line. Nothing changes, nothing excites. It is dull, repetitive, and unending. But in that very dullness lies calm. The ocean, boring though it was, lulled people into acceptance, and perhaps it can lull you now, too, as you drift on its slow, steady tide. This is the stage upon which our story unfolds, not a sea of monsters, but a sea of monotony, not adventure, but routine, not excitement, but boredom. The ocean was vast, and it was dull, and it is in that dullness, strange as it may seem, that we find history's quietest truths. When we imagine the ocean, we often think of adventure, storms that shake great ships, voyages to unknown lands, or glittering treasures lost beneath the waves. But the truth is that, for most people across history, the ocean was not a stage of excitement, but of monotony. It was background noise, a constant presence that demanded steady labor and brought little surprise. The ocean's greatest gift was not wonder, but repetition, and repetition, while dull, is what held lives together. Picture a small medieval village at the edge of the sea. At night, the shoreline is quiet. The waves roll in with the same rhythm they did the day before, the month before, the century before. A fisherman leans against his boat, listening to the surf without thought. The sound is steady, calming, but also numbing. There is no drama in it tonally. The endless cycle of water, pulling and retreating. This was the world that countless people lived in, a world defined not by adventure, but by sameness. The fishermen woke before dawn, not to chase excitement, but to follow a routine. They pushed their boats out at the same hour, cast nets in the same spots, and hauled in the same fish. Nothing changed except the weather, and even the weather repeated itself. Storms came, storms passed, the sea remained. To live with the ocean was to accept that each day would mirror the last, with few surprises. The work was necessary, but rarely thrilling. Even the tools of ocean life carried monotony. Nets were patched again and again, ropes coiled the same way each night, boats scraped of salt until hands grew stiff. A young boy might learn these habits at his father's side, and when he grew into a man, he passed the same motions to his son. Generations repeated the same small gestures, without pause, without variation. What looked like survival was, in truth, a slow dance of dullness. The ocean itself offered no variety to the senses. Its sound was always the same: the crash of waves, the cry of gulls, the hiss of foam against rocks. Its smell was always the same: salt sharp in the air, fish sour in the baskets, tar heavy on ropes. To those who lived with it, the sea did not feel alive. It felt ordinary, as familiar as the ground underfoot. It lulled rather than stirred. It dulled rather than excited. And yet, within this monotony, there was comfort. The sameness of the ocean was a promise. Its waves told people that life would go on, not in bursts of glory, but in steady cycles. The ocean was not a stage for heroes, but a mirror of ordinary endurance. Its dullness was its truth, and in that dullness, people found survival. The story of the sea begins here, not with grand voyages, but with this quiet truth: the ocean's greatest role in history was to be boring. At dawn, the fishermen stirred from their sleep, not to greet adventure, but to face a cycle as old as the tide itself. The routine began before the first light reached the horizon. They moved in silence, their bodies already trained to the rhythm of early rising. Boots slid onto tired feet, cloaks were thrown across shoulders, and baskets were lifted with the same motions performed yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. The ocean did not allow variety. It demanded repetition. The boats themselves waited like weary animals tethered to the shore. Small, heavy, smelling of tar and salt, they carried no promise of surprise. A fisherman pushed his vessel into the shallows, water chilling his legs, while his companion dragged nets across the sand. The ropes were stiff, the knots familiar, each movement repeated thousands of times before. Nothing about this ritual suggested discovery. It was habit, and habit dulled the senses. Once at sea, the monotony deepened. The men rowed in rhythm, their oars dipping into water with the same hollow splash. The sound repeated endlessly, broken only by the faint creak of wood. They spoke little, not out of mystery, but because there was nothing new to say. The same complaints about aching backs, the same jokes about stubborn nets, the same mutters about whether these filled the silence and then faded, leaving only the sea's steady breath. Casting the nets was no moment of excitement. It was a chore performed with the same gestures, hands hauling, ropes straining, nets sinking. The waiting was dull, the pulling was dull, the results predictable. Herring, cod, maybe the occasional odd catch, but nothing to stir surprise. Fish were measured not in novelty but in number, and numbers rarely changed. A small catch was disappointing, a large one exhausting, but both were ordinary. The sea gave what it gave, and the men accepted it with the boredom of routine. Hours passed without notice, marked only by the sun's climb. The men sat in boats, staring at the horizon, their eyes glazed by sameness. The sea stretched endlessly, flat and gray, broken only by the distant shapes of other boats repeating the same dull rituals. Each vessel mirrored the next, each fisherman mirrored his neighbor, until individuality blurred. Life at sea was not adventure. It was an echo, repeated over and over without change. By the time the boats turned back toward shore, the men carried little sense of achievement. The work was necessary, yes, but it was not inspiring. They unloaded fish with the same weary arms, dragged nets ashore with the same grunts, and faced the same tasks awaiting them tomorrow. Nothing marked the day as special. It blended into the one before and the one to follow, part of a cycle too steady to break. This was the reality of medieval fishing, a life not of storms and stories, but of quiet repetition. The ocean, for these men, was not a place of adventure. It was a mirror of dull survival. The sameness of ocean life was not confined to fishing alone. Even those who remained on shore lived by its dull rhythm, their chores tied to the tide as securely as the boats. Wives and children stood at the edges of the water, waiting for the return of the catch, their eyes scanning the same horizon each day. What they saw was not surprise, but routine. The gray line of the sea, the familiar shapes of boats, the predictable splash of oars. Morning bled into afternoon, afternoon into night. With little to distinguish one day from another, The waves themselves embodied monotony. Each one rolled forward, crested, and fell back in the same cycle, repeating so faithfully that they seemed like the ticking of an enormous clock. The ocean was not a place of variety. It was a place of patterns. To live near it was to absorb its endless rhythm into one's own body. The heart beat to the waves, the breath mirrored the tides. It was soothing, yes, but it was also numbing. There was no climax, no story arc, only the steady murmur of repetition. Chores at the shoreline reflected this rhythm. Nets had to be dried, mended, and folded again, each task performed in the same sequence. Salted fish were stacked in barrels, layer upon layer, indistinguishable except for number. Ropes were coiled into neat spirals, their fibers stiff with brine, their patterns unchanging. Even the smallest task, scraping scales from wood, sweeping sand from doorsteps, repairing broken baskets, was done not once but endlessly. Life by the sea was a life of cycles within cycles, each one dull, each one essential. Children learned quickly that the ocean brought little surprise. Their play often mimicked their parents' labor, tossing small stones like nets, dragging scraps of rope, splashing in rhythm with the waves. They absorbed the monotony before they understood it, their games foreshadowing the lives they would inherit. In time, the boys would row and fish, the girls would salt and mend, and the pattern would continue. Generations moved through the same motions, as though caught in nets themselves, held by the ocean's steady pull. Even festivals, meant to break monotony, only emphasized it. Celebrations marked the same dates each year, the same prayers for safe return, the same dances beside the same water. People smiled, sang, and drank, but beneath the noise lay the unchanged truth. Tomorrow, the nets would still need mending, the boats would still need pushing. The ocean would still roll forward without pause. The sea's dullness was never absent, even when hidden behind ritual cheer. Thus, the ocean shaped life not with drama, but with sameness. It was not a tale of sudden change, but of endless return. Its waves erased difference, its chores erased variety, until existence itself became a kind of tide. What people feared was not danger, but interruption, because the dull rhythm of the sea was what sustained them, day after day, generation after generation. The shoreline, the boats, the nets, and the waves, all of these together, formed a world where monotony was the true ruler. For those who lived with the sea, change was rare, and excitement was fleeting. What endured was the steady rhythm of repetition, the boats leaving in the morning, the nets cast and hauled, the fish salted and stored, the ropes mended, the waves breaking on the sand. Each day looked so much like the last that memory blurred. A man could recall storms, yes, or rare moments of loss, but he would struggle to name the differences between one calm morning and the next. The sameness became the story. This is the dull truth that history often forgets. We hear about grand voyages, about sailors reaching distant lands, about merchants bringing spices and silk across oceans. Those stories shine with adventure, but they were exceptions. For every ship that crossed to another continent, hundreds more simply fished the same waters, rode the same routes, and hauled the same catch. Their lives were not written in chronicles, but in repetition. They did not become legends, but their monotony fed entire villages. Even the records that survive carry this sameness. Parish accounts list fish tithed to churches, the numbers repeating with little change. Household rolls mention barrels of herring, salted and delivered, week after week. Ship logs detail weather in flat words, calm seas, light winds. Nothing in these pages bursts with drama. Instead, they hum with the quiet music of routine, preserved in ink, just as it was lived in flesh. History often ignores it, yet it was the fabric of most lives. To step into this world is to step into stillness. Imagine standing by the water at night, hearing the waves roll in, feeling the salt sting in the air. The moon reflects on the surface, casting a silver path that vanishes as quickly as it appears. Around you, the village sleeps. The boats will go out again tomorrow, just as they did today. The sound you hear, the smell you breathe, the rhythm you feel, they are the same that generations before you knew, and the same that generations after you will endure. There is no climax here, only continuity. The ocean does not tell stories in chapters, but in cycles, and yet this dullness is soothing. The ocean's sameness promised survival, stability, and calm for those who lived beside it. The monotony was not a curse, but a truth in changing, reliable, and steady. The ocean was boring, yes, but in that boredom lay safety. The waves could be counted on to return, the fish to fill the nets, the routines to anchor life. In this, the sea became less a stage for adventure and more a cradle for endurance. So begins our journey, not with storm or treasure, but with the calm, repetitive truth of the sea. From here, we turn to those who lived their lives in this monotony, the fishermen, whose daily labor defined the ocean's dull history. The life of a medieval fisherman began in darkness, not with excitement, but with the weight of routine pressing down like the night itself. Before dawn, when the village still slept and the only sound was the slow roll of the tide, men stirred from their huts. Their bodies carried the rhythm of the sea so deeply that waking felt automatic. They did not rise with anticipation, but with resignation. The day ahead would look no different from the one before it. The same nets, the same boats, the same fish. They gathered in silence. Words were unnecessary, for each man knew his place. Boots slipped onto feet hardened by salt and sand. Cloaks hung heavy across shoulders still stiff from yesterday's labor. Hands reached for ropes, oars, and baskets without thought. The movements practiced so long, they required no memory. The monotony of preparation was as much a part of them as breath itself. Down at the shore, the boats waited, black shapes against the faint glow of the horizon. They smelled of tar and brine, patched and repatched, until their planks carried more repairs than original wood. Each vessel rocked slightly in the shallow water, restless but familiar, like an old horse used for plowing fields. The men pushed them forward with steady effort, water slapping against their legs, the cold seeping through cloth. There was no rush, no shouts of urgency, only the quiet murmur of repetition. Once afloat, the fishermen rowed into open water. The sound of oars dipping and rising was hollow, a rhythm so steady that it became invisible to thought. Muscles worked automatically, arms lifting and pulling without variety. A man could row for hours and not recall the motion, his body moving as though asleep. Around him, the ocean stretched gray and flat, offering nothing to break the sameness. Even the cries of gulls seemed rehearsed. The same notes struck at the same intervals. Casting the nets required no imagination. A man knew the weight of rope in his hand, the feel of knots against his palm, the dull splash as the mesh sank below the surface. It was the same sound his father heard, and his father before him. The nets opened, spread, and disappeared, the water swallowing them as though swallowing time itself. Then came the waiting, long and uneventful, the men watching the horizon with eyes that had seen it all before. There was no glory in these hours, no sudden thrill of discovery. The ocean did not reward them with variety. Some days the nets came back heavy, some days light, but always they came back with fish, scales glinting, bodies flopping, the same familiar species caught: herring, mackerel. The sea never surprised, it only repeated. This was the dawn routine of the fishermen, not heroic, not adventurous, but dull. A cycle of labor bound by the sea's steady hand, repeated endlessly, shaping lives in its monotony. The nets, once cast into the water, became both the heart of the work and the center of monotony. They were heavy, rough, and soaked through with years of salt and wear. Each one bore patches, thick cords stitched into weak places, evidence of countless repairs. The fishermen handled them with the same caution each day, spreading, lowering, and hauling in practiced motions. No gesture was new, no sequence of effort unfamiliar. The net was less a tool of adventure than a reminder of endless repetition. When the men began to haul, their bodies bent in the same rhythm, hands gripped rope, shoulders strained, backs arched against the pull. Water streamed from the cords, splashing into the boat, soaking clothing already stiff with salt. The sound was always the same, the dull slap of wet rope against wood, the grunt of effort, the faint hiss of the sea. To the men, this was not dramatic, it was routine. They pulled not with expectation of surprise, but with weary certainty of what would emerge. The catch itself rarely altered. Herring glinted silver in the weak light, cod lay heavy and plain, mackerel twitched with brief life before lying still. Their bodies filled the nets in patterns that mirrored the season, not the day. A man might haul in dozens or hundreds, but the sight never changed. Fish were fish no matter how many, no matter how heavy. They carried the same shape, the same smell, the same dull promise of food and trade. Once dumped into the boat, the catch became another task. The men sorted quickly, tossing the smaller fish into baskets, laying the larger ones flat on planks. Their hands moved without thought, scales catching under nails, slime slicking palms. The smell rose, thick, sharp, familiar, an odor so constant it seemed part of the very air. Fishermen did not notice it anymore. It clung to them like another skin, a mark of their work and their monotony. Then the nets had to be prepared again, the ropes coiled, the cords untangled, the patches checked, the weight measured. This process repeated over and over, each throw followed by another, each haul followed by another. The hours stretched long, marked not by moments of drama, but by this cycle of cast, pull, sort, mend. It was as if the men were caught in their own nets, bound to a rhythm that offered no escape. Even the sea, vast and endless, felt small within this cycle. Its surface changed little, its voice remained steady, its gifts predictable. A man at sea did not feel wonder. He felt repetition, and when his hands ached and his back throbbed, he knew that tomorrow would bring the same. The nets would be cast, the nets would be hauled, and the sea would return the same silver harvest as always. This was the true monotony of fishing, not danger, not glory, but endless hauling of the same catch, day after day. Once the fish were hauled into baskets and carried ashore, the monotony only deepened. What seemed a moment of labor at sea turned into hours of sorting, salting, and storing. The catch, though essential, was rarely exciting. It was not treasure. It was not novelty. It was food, and food repeated itself without end. Herring, cod, mackerel, these three dominated the diets of countless villages. Their names filled records, their bodies filled barrels, their taste filled mouths, until it became impossible to distinguish one meal from another. Herring especially was the emblem of dullness. Small, bony, easily salted, it was caught in such vast numbers that it became the standard meal for both peasants and nobles. Barrels of herring traveled inland, carried by carts to towns and monasteries, but the taste remained the same. Morning after morning, week after week, people chewed the same flesh, swallowed the same brine, endured the same monotony of diet. A noble might flavor it with spice, a peasant might eat it plain, but at the core it was still herring, and changed, unavoidable. Cod carried its own weight of sameness. Large and plain, its flesh dried well and lasted 4 months, making it the preferred food for winter and long voyages. But with preservation came dullness. Salt stiffened the meat, robbed it of flavor, turned it into fuel rather than enjoyment. Sailors gnawed it with weary jaws, monks ate it in silence, peasants boiled it into stews. Each bite reminded them not of variety, but of survival. Cod was not a feast. Cod was a cycle. Mackerel, though less common, offered no greater delight. Its oily flesh filled the air with a strong odor, clinging to hands and huts alike. Villagers grew so used to the smell that it vanished from notice, though strangers wrinkled their noses. The fish, once salted, blended into the same barrels, the same storage pits, the same meals. To eat mackerel was to eat monotony wrapped in scales. The records reflect this dull truth. Monastic accounts list 50 barrels of herring, 20 of cod. Ship logs note supplies of dried fish. Household rolls mention fish, salted and stored. The words change little across decades, the entries repeating as if copied from one year to the next. The ocean's bounty was plentiful, but it was also predictable. It fed, but it did not excite. For families, meals blurred together. Children chewed herring until they could not remember its first taste. Fishermen's wives salted fish until their hands cracked, never questioning the sameness. Even feast days often included fish, though served with bread or ale to disguise monotony. What should have been joy was still repetition. The ocean's dullness carried to the table. Thus, the fisherman's work did not end with the catch. It extended into every bite, every meal, every household that lived from the sea. The ocean gave life, yes, but it gave it in the same form, again and again. Fish became not food, but routine essential, endless, and unchanging. The monotony of fishing did not end with the nets or the meals. It seeped into the conversations of those who lived with the sea, shaping the very words spoken each day. Fishermen, though accustomed to silence at sea, filled the hours on land with the same repeated complaints. Their voices echoed like the waves themselves, steady, predictable, and dull. A man might grumble about torn nets, another about aching joints, another about a poor catch, but these complaints never varied. They were the same yesterday, the same today, and would be the same tomorrow. Even humor carried the weight of repetition. Jokes about missing socks at the river, about stubborn nets refusing to yield fish, about boats that leaked more water than they carried all recycled, told and retold, until laughter itself grew tired. The jokes were not meant to surprise but to comfort, reminders that sameness was shared. In their dullness, they were like the ocean, unchanging, familiar, inevitable. At night, around fires or in taverns, the talk circled back to fish, not because it was interesting, but because it was constant. Men spoke of how many barrels were salted, how many fish spoiled, how many hours lost to storms. There was no great drama, no heroic tale. There were only numbers and measures, repeated like a litany of dull survival. The words carried no excitement, but they carried the weight of necessity. Wives and families shared in this monotony. They salted fish, mended nets, patched clothing stiff with brine. Their own complaints echoed the men's, the smell that clung to huts, the endless meals of herring, the sore fingers from tying ropes. Children, too, joined the chorus, sighing at the sight of fish served yet again. No one escaped the cycle, and no one expected to. It was life, and life was boring. Records revealed the same dull chorus in ink. Clerks noted supplies of fish with the same phrases across decades. Markets listed sales in repetitive lines. Monasteries recorded meals of cod on Fridays, again and again, year after year. The documents read like echoes, as though history itself were caught in the fisherman's net. Unable to break free from repetition, the boredom became endurance. Fishermen rose each day not with hope of novelty, but with acceptance of sameness. They did not seek excitement from the sea, because they knew it would not come. The ocean gave what it always gave, and they took it with weary patience. Their survival depended not on adventure, but on repetition, on the dull comfort of routines, too steady to break. And so, the fishermen endured, rowing, casting, hauling, salting, eating, complaining. The ocean offered no drama, only cycles. Their lives were not stories of surprise but of sameness, woven into the dull fabric of history. This was the monotony of medieval fishing, boring, repetitive, and essential. From here, our attention turns to those who recorded the sea's dullness in words. The clerks and ship logs that mirrored the ocean's endless rhythm on parchment. If the fisherman's life was monotonous in labor, the clerk's life beside the ocean was monotonous in ink. Theirs was not the rhythm of oars or nets, but the scratching of quills across parchment. Each day, they sat at crude wooden desks, hunched under candlelight or weak daylight, recording the ocean's cycles in words that carried no drama. Ship logs, market records, port tallies, these were their ocean, and their tides never changed. The ship's log, in particular, was the epitome of dullness. Every voyage demanded a record, not because the information was thrilling, but because bureaucracy insisted on it. Wind, steady. Nets, cast. Caught 50 herring, salted and stored. These were the kinds of lines repeated page after page, year after year. A storm might occasionally break the monotony, but storms themselves were described in plain phrases. Waves high, mast damaged, repaired with rope. No flourish, no poetry, just the steady rhythm of survival on paper. The clerk himself knew no adventure. He rarely set foot on the deck, rarely touched the nets, rarely saw the fish beyond counting barrels and writing numbers. His world was smaller than the ocean, yet just as repetitive. He sharpened his quill, dipped it in ink, and wrote the same words again and again, until the parchment itself seemed tired of carrying them. His hand ached, his back stiffened, but his records showed no evidence of his discomfort. They showed only sameness. Cargo tallies were perhaps the dullest of all. 2 barrels herring, 1 barrel cod, 5 nets mended, 1 rope replaced. These lists stretched across parchment, like the ocean stretched across the horizon, flat, featureless, unending. The clerk recorded them, not with interest, but with obligation. Each item mattered for trade and survival, but none carried life or color. It was all numbers, all repetition, all necessity stripped of variety. Markets mirrored the same monotony. Ledgers detailed the sale of fish, the price of salt, the repairs to boats. 20 fish sold, 30 salted, 40 in store. To the clerk, these numbers blurred into each other. A line written today looked identical to a line written last month. To read them now is to see history not as story, but as repetition frozen in ink. The sound of the clerk's work was its own, dull music, the scratch of quill on parchment, the creak of wooden chair, the faint sigh escaping weary lungs. No song accompanied this labor, no joy marked its completion. The pages piled up, one after another, just as nets piled on shore, just as fish filled barrels. It was work without climax, words without surprise, and yet, without these records, the ocean's monotony might have vanished from memory. Ironically, it is the very dullness of the clerk's words that allows us to glimpse the dullness of life by the sea. Their boredom preserved boredom, their sameness captured sameness. The ocean rolled endlessly, and the clerk wrote endlessly, each reflecting the other in cycles too steady to break. Among all the records a clerk kept, the most monotonous were the daily weather notes. Every ship required them, every port demanded them, every voyage produced them, and yet their content rarely shifted. Winds moderate, skies cloudy, seas calm, line after line, page after page. The same words appeared with such regularity that one might mistake a year's log for a single week. The ocean changed, but the words describing it did not. The act itself was mechanical. At dawn, the clerk stepped onto the deck, squinted at the horizon, and noted what he saw. If clouds covered the sun, he wrote overcast. If the water rippled slightly, he wrote small waves. If a breeze stirred his cloak, he wrote light wind. There was no need for flourish, no desire for detail. His duty was to reduce the sky and sea into phrases as dull as the waves themselves. Then quill dipped again. He returned below to write the same words at noon, and again, at dusk, days blurred, calm seas, steady winds, winds light, seas smooth, clouds thick, rain light. Each line repeated with only minor variations, as if the ocean itself conspired to bore the one who wrote it. Even when storms came, their drama was flattened, waves heavy, ship pitched, mast strained. The danger was real, but the record made it lifeless. For the clerk, the storm was not an event to remember, but another phrase to repeat, another line to file away. Sailors joked that the clerk's ink was as salty as the sea, carrying its dullness into every word. They teased him for writing wind steady so often that he might write it in his sleep. But the clerk did not laugh. To him, it was duty. His job was not to tell stories, but to preserve sameness. If the sea was repetitive, then the record had to mirror that truth. His boredom was proof of his success. The monotony spread beyond his own eyes. Other clerks, stationed in distant ports, wrote the same lines at the same hours. Together, they filled the world with echoes of weather, thousands of parchments whispering the same phrases in unison. A reader traveling from one harbor to another would find no difference, no uniqueness, only the same dull litany. Cloudy.com/moderate winds. The world's oceans, vast and unpredictable, shrank into the uniformity of clerks' notes. Centuries later, these records survive, and their sameness endures. Scholars open old ship logs, and instead of drama, they find repetition. Page after page, the seas are calm, the winds are moderate, the skies are cloudy. Rarely does a storm intrude. Rarely does anything break the rhythm, and when it does, it is described so flatly that the excitement vanishes. Thus, the weather notes of maritime clerks teach us not about wonder, but about dullness. They remind us that history was not lived as adventure, but as routine. The ocean rolled, the clouds shifted, the wind blew, and the clerk wrote it down again, and again, and again. If weather notes drained the ocean of its color, then cargo tallies drained human labor of its meaning. Every barrel, every rope, every tool had to be recorded. Not because anyone found it fascinating, but because order demanded it. The clerk's quill moved over parchment like the tide over sand, leaving behind lines that looked almost identical, no matter the day, the ship, or the port. The lists began the same way each time. 1 barrel herring, 2 barrels cod, 1 sack salt, 3 coils rope. Each line followed another, with no change in form. The numbers altered slightly, but the rhythm of words did not. The clerk filled page after page with this mechanical chant until he no longer saw the items themselves. He saw only units, barrels, sacks, coils, the individuality of the workmen who hauled them, the families who ate them, the merchants who sold them all, dissolved into tallies. The marketplace relied on these records, but even merchants found them dull. Buyers needed to know how many barrels were available, not whether they smelled, whether they were heavy, whether they reminded the fishermen of yesterday. The clerk was expected to strip all detail away until only quantity remained. To read a tally was to read absence, the absence of life, the absence of texture, the absence of anything that might interest. Yet the tallies never ended. A single voyage could fill dozens of lines. 5 barrels, herring, 4 barrels salted cod, 2 nets patched, 1 mast repaired. The same phrases appeared again on the next voyage, and the next, and the next. The ocean's vastness shrank into the monotony of cargo lists, as if the sea existed only to produce numbers. Even errors failed to bring relief. When a barrel went missing, or a rope was missing, the correction was written as flatly as the tally itself. Error. 1 barrel removed. The moment might spark frustration among sailors, but on the page it looked no different than 100 other lines. The clerk's ink erased emotion, leaving only dull accuracy. For the clerk, the monotony seeped into his very body. His fingers cramped from repeating the same strokes of numbers. His back ached from leaning over pages without variety. His eyes blurred as he scanned rows that differed by little more than a digit. He might sigh, pause, and stretch, but then he returned to his tally, the same as before. Nothing changed, because nothing was meant to. Centuries later, the cargo tallies remain, filling archives with their dull repetition. Historians find them valuable for understanding trade, but reading them is like trudging through mud. The same words drag the eye. The same rhythm slows the mind. They are not stories. They are cycles, frozen in ink. Thus, the cargo tallies reflect the ocean's dull truth, that most of its history was not discovery, but repetition. The ships brought the same fish, the same salt, the same rope, and the clerks wrote the same lists, again and again, until the ocean itself seemed reduced to inventory. When all the notes were gathered weather reports, cargo tallies, repairs, and rations, they formed a record that mirrored the ocean itself, vast in size, yet empty of variety. A single ship's log might run for months, its pages thick with ink, but when read closely it offered nothing more than repetition. The details, stripped of color, became indistinguishable from one another. To leaf through the book was to experience the same dull rhythm that the clerk lived, a monotony of words as steady as the tide. Winds moderate, nets hauled, caught herring. Winds steady, nets hauled, caught cod. Winds light, nets hauled, caught herring. Line after line, the variations were slight, the rhythm identical. A reader might drift into a trance, lulled by the sameness, until the lines blurred and the words lost meaning altogether. In this way, the log itself became a kind of ocean, endless, repetitive, soothing in its dullness, but numbing in its lack of change. The clerk accepted this sameness as duty. His job was not to create interest, but to preserve detail, no matter how boring. If the sea produced fish, he wrote fish. If the sea produced calm, he wrote calm. The log was not a story, but a ledger of endurance. It demanded patience, not imagination. To finish a volume was not an accomplishment, but a continuation. Another voyage would begin, another record would follow, each one as plain as the last. Over time, the records accumulated. Shelves in ports and monasteries filled with stacks of ship logs, their bindings stained with salt and smoke. To the untrained eye, they looked interchangeable. Open one, and you found the same lines as the next. The ocean cycles repeated in ink, preserved across decades, even centuries, until history itself seemed caught in the monotony of parchment. And yet, hidden in this dullness, was a kind of survival. The sameness of the records meant stability. It meant that the ships returned, the fish were caught, the supplies were steady. Boredom was the price of endurance, and the clerks paid it willingly. In their monotony, they created continuity. The ocean might rise and fall, but the ink remained, proof of lives held together by repetition. Today, these records remain our clearest window into the ocean's past. They do not tell of monsters or heroes. They tell of nets hauled, barrels salted, ropes mended, winds measured. They tell of boredom, written carefully, preserved faithfully. They remind us that history was not made of adventure alone, but of endless cycles that sustained ordinary lives. Thus ends the tale of the clerks, whose ink mirrored the waves. Their monotony leads us onward, away from the desks and back to the sea itself, where sailors endured another form of dullness, the long, endless voyages, where waiting became the ocean's truest story. To sail across the sea was not, for most, a tale of discovery or danger. It was a tale of waiting. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, flat and gray. And days at sea unfolded, not with adventure, but with monotony. Sailors woke each morning to the same horizon, ate the same meals, performed the same tasks, and fell asleep under the same stars. The voyage was not a journey through events, but through repetition. A day at sea began before sunrise, when men rose from cramped hammocks in the hold. Their bodies were stiff, their clothes damp with salt, their minds dulled by routine. Above them, the deck creaked with the same old rhythm. Some men pumped water from the bilge, others scrubbed planks, others checked ropes. These tasks never changed, only repeated. To a sailor, the ocean was not alive, it was a mirror of his own labor, constant, predictable, and dull. When the ship drifted in calm weather, the monotony deepened. With no storms to fight and no winds to chase, the vessel sat heavy on the still sea, its sails slack, its crew restless. Men leaned on rails, staring at water that looked no different today than yesterday. Hours passed without sound, except for gulls circling above or the creak of timber expanding in the sun. To wait at sea was to feel time stretch into endless sameness. Meals brought no relief. Each day the sailors chewed the same salted fish, gnawed the same dry bread, and drank the same stale water or sour ale. The flavor never changed, only the texture, and often for the worse. Some men joked about the meals, others cursed them, but all endured them in silence more often than not. Eating was not an act of joy, but of survival, a reminder that sameness filled both stomach and sky. Nights were no different. The crew divided into watches, pacing the deck beneath stars that seemed to shine without variation. The constellations offered navigation, but little wonder. Men stared upward, marking positions, noting changes, yet their eyes grew weary from the endless repetition of the heavens. The same stars rose, the same stars fell, and the ocean below gave no sign of progress. Even conversation grew dull. Sailors repeated the same jokes, told the same stories, argued about the same small matters. They spoke of home, of food they missed, of weather patterns, but always in circles. Words filled the silence, but they did not break the monotony. They became another part of the cycle, just as predictable as the waves. Thus, life at sea became a lesson in endurance. Adventure was rare, storms occasional, discovery exceptional. What endured was waiting for wind, waiting for land, waiting for change that rarely came. To sail was to wait, and to wait was to live the ocean's dullest truth. If the sea itself was monotonous, the food on board made the monotony complete. Sailors measured their voyages not by miles crossed, but by meals endured. Breakfast, dinner, and supper blurred into one another until the men no longer thought of them as events. They were simply pauses in the day, filled with the same dry, tasteless provisions. The staple was salted fish, usually cod or herring, preserved weeks or months before the voyage began. By the time it reached a sailor's plate, the flesh had grown stiff, its salt so thick it burned the tongue. Men chewed slowly, softening the meat with water or ale, but the flavor never changed. Bite after bite, day after day, the same sharp taste filled their mouths. What once had been food became something else, a symbol of the sea's dullness. Bread, too, became an emblem of repetition. Ship's biscuits, baked hard to last the journey, were little more than slabs of flour and water. They cracked teeth, crumbled into dust, and carried the faint taste of mold as weeks passed. Some sailors softened them in soup, others soaked them in ale, but nothing altered the monotony. A biscuit was always the same, dry, hard, and dull. Drink offered no relief. Fresh water quickly turned stale in barrels, its surface gathering film, its taste souring with time. Sailors gagged but swallowed, for there was no alternative. Ale and wine, rationed carefully, lost their sharpness and grew flat. Even grog, the mixture of spirits and water meant to lift spirits, became part of the cycle. A man raised his cup, not with joy but with resignation. The monotony of meals spread through the ship like a fog. Men sat together in silence, gnawing, swallowing, wiping their mouths. Conversation dwindled, because there was nothing new to say about food that never changed. One might joke about the toughness of the biscuit or the saltiness of the fish, but the laughter faded quickly. Tomorrow's meal would be the same, and the joke would feel stale. Illness often added to the sameness. Scurvy, born from the absence of fresh fruit, gnawed at gums and joints. Its symptoms became another cycle. Men groaned, teeth loosened, skin spotted, and still they chewed the same meals. No cure appeared, only more of the same provisions. To eat was to endure, not to enjoy. Some sailors dreamt of food as they rowed or kept watch. They spoke of bread baked soft and warm, of meat roasted on a spit, of apples bursting with juice. These dreams repeated as often as the meals themselves, a chorus of longing that never changed. Hope became as dull as hunger, both repeating endlessly under the same gray sky. Thus, food at sea was not sustenance alone, but monotony made flesh. It offered survival, yes, but at the cost of variety. Each meal reminded the sailors that life on the ocean was not a story of change. It was a story of sameness, salted, dried, and gnawed into memory. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the ocean changed its face, but not its nature. Night at sea was as monotonous as day, marked by watches that repeated with the precision of a clock. Sailors divided into groups, each responsible for keeping the ship steady, the sails trimmed, and the horizon scanned. The pattern never shifted. Every night, men climbed from their hammocks, rubbed sleep from their eyes, and took their place on deck under the stars. The sea did not rest, and so neither could they. The watch began in silence. The creak of wood against wood, the sigh of ropes in the wind, the faint splash of water against the hull, these were the sounds that filled the night. A man leaned against the rail, staring out at water that looked no different from the day before. The moon glowed, the stars shone, the horizon stretched unbroken. It was beautiful, perhaps, but beauty dulled when seen night after night without change. Tasks repeated in cycles. A sailor adjusted a rope. Another walked the deck, counting steps to keep awake. One man scanned the horizon, though nothing ever appeared. Hours passed, with little more than the shuffle of boots and the whisper of sails. The ocean revealed nothing, and the sky revealed everything, yet nothing new. The constellations wheeled above, eternal in their order. Their positions so fixed that a sailor could mark time by their slow crawl. But time marked in stars is slow, and the monotony of night thickened with every minute. Men passed the hours in talk, but even conversation fell into repetition. They shared the same stories, told of the same villages left behind, the same food they longed for. The youngest asked questions, the older had answered many times. Jokes lost their spark, repeated until they were little more than sighs. Laughter turned into silence, and silence into the steady rhythm of boredom. The hardest struggle of the night watch was not danger but drowsiness. The body longed for rest, but the sea demanded eyes open. A man might nod briefly, only to be nudged awake. Another might hum softly, repeating the same tune again and again, a lifeline against sleep. Some chewed on biscuit crumbs or sipped water, the flavor as dull as the task itself. Nothing broke the cycle but the slow passage of hours, measured not by events but by endurance. When the watch ended, the men slipped back below deck, and others replaced them. The pattern continued without pause, one group after another, pacing the planks, staring at stars, adjusting ropes, waiting for dawn. It was a cycle, as unchanging as the tide. Night offered no excitement, no interruption. Only the dull truth that the ocean never slept, and so men must always keep watch. Thus, the night at sea, for all its quiet grandeur, became another repetition. Stars above, water below, men in between, enduring sameness under the endless sky. If the physical labor of the sea was monotonous, the mental weight of waiting was heavier still. Endless days and nights pressed on the minds of sailors, wearing down thought until even imagination felt dull. The horizon never changed, the food never changed, the tasks never changed. It was not only their bodies that repeated cycles, but their minds. Waiting became a prison, built not of walls, but of sameness. Time moved strangely at sea. A week could feel like a single day, and a single day could stretch like a year. Sailors counted the passing hours by meals, watches, and small chores. But these markers blurred until memory lost its grip. A man might forget whether a joke had been told yesterday or a month ago. He might forget which storm had torn a sail, which calm had stalled the ship. The ocean erased differences, leaving only monotony behind. The boredom brought with it a quiet despair. Sailors spoke of home, but even their longing became repetitive. The same descriptions of wives, children, and villages echoed through the air, comforting at first, but eventually hollow. Nostalgia, repeated too often, turned into another form of monotony. Each man's story blended with the others until homesickness became a chorus of sameness, dull in its predictability. Some men found their tempers shortened. The smallest irritation, the creak of a bench, the snore of a companion, the smell of another's clothing could ignite grumbling or quarrels. Yet even these quarrels, repeated, arguments circling back to the same points, the same complaints. The boredom of waiting had a way of making anger itself monotonous, turning conflict into another cycle of words repeated without resolution. Others retreated into silence. They spoke less and less, their faces blank, their voices flat, when duty forced them to answer. For these men, the ocean's monotony had seeped into their very being. Their movements slowed, their laughter vanished, their eyes dulled like weathered wood. They endured the voyage, not as participants, but as shadows, existing only because the cycle carried them forward. Dreams, too, became colored by monotony. Men dreamed of food, of green fields, of familiar streets, but always the same images, repeated night after night. Some woke with relief, others with frustration, but all knew the dreams would return unchanged. The mind itself mirrored the sea, circling back, erasing difference, holding men captive in sameness. When land finally appeared, the excitement was real, yet even that joy repeated. The shouts, the rush of relief, the laughter at the sight of a shoreline, they were as familiar as the meals and the watches. For every voyage ended, another would begin, carrying the same cycle forward. The men knew it, and that knowledge dulled even their joy. Thus, the emotional toll of ocean travel was not chaos or danger, but boredom. To live at sea was to surrender to sameness, to endure waiting until it became identity. The ocean shaped not only bodies, but minds, teaching them that survival was not in excitement, but in repetition. Life in the coastal villages, though lived on solid ground, mirrored the dull rhythm of the sea. The ocean's cycles reached into every hut and workshop, shaping tasks that repeated with as much monotony as rowing or hauling nets. A man might spend his days mending ropes instead of casting them, or salting fish instead of catching them, but the sameness was no less heavy. The village itself breathed in time with the tide, rising and falling with a rhythm that dulled imagination. At dawn, the village stirred. Women stepped from their doorways with baskets and cloth, their movements identical to yesterday's and the day before. The smell of brine clung to the air, mingling with smoke from hearth fires. Nets lay spread across the ground, waiting for hands to repair them. Wooden tubs stood ready to receive fish, their rims crusted with salt from countless uses. The setting never changed. To live here was to see the same scene painted every morning, as if the village itself were caught in a loop. Net mending consumed much of the day. Women and children sat in small groups, pulling fibers tight, knotting ropes, patching tiers. Their fingers moved without thought, guided by habit more than attention. Conversation filled the air, but it, too, followed familiar lines. Complaints about aching hands, jokes about clumsy knots, gossip repeated until its freshness faded. By afternoon, the nets looked whole again, though tomorrow they would tear once more, and the cycle would begin again. Fish salting carried its own monotony. Barrels were lined, layered with salt, and filled with the same dull catch: herring, cod, mackerel. Hands sprinkled salt until the skin cracked, the motions so familiar that they required no thought. The air grew thick with the smell of brine, sharp and unchanging, clinging to clothing and hair. Even the sight of full barrels brought little satisfaction. They were not trophies, but necessities, destined for trade or storage, destined to repeat the same cycle of preparation and consumption. Children played along the shore, but their games often imitated the same work. They pretended to haul nets, to carry baskets, to salt fish. Their laughter echoed the labor of their parents, preparing them not for new lives, but for the same dull tasks that awaited when childhood ended. The ocean's monotony was inherited, passed down through play as much as through duty. The village itself seemed frozen in time. Its huts, patched with driftwood and seagrass, leaned against the same winds. Its pathways, worn by countless feet, led always to the same beach, the same boats, the same horizon. To walk through the village was to feel repetition underfoot, to see the same faces engaged in the same tasks. Nothing changed except the season, and even the seasons cycled back to sameness. Thus, the coastal village was not a place of rest from the sea, but a reflection of it. Its people lived by the same cycles, endured the same routines, carried the same burdens. The land offered no escape. It only mirrored the ocean's dull, unchanging truth. The work of salting fish was the heartbeat of the village, steady and repetitive, without variation across generations. Each morning, barrels were dragged into place, their wooden staves smelling of brine and damp earth. Workers lined them with thick layers of salt, their hands raw from the coarse crystals. Into these barrels went fish after fish, piled in methodical layers. One row of herring, a scatter of salt, another row of herring, another scatter of salt. The pattern repeated until the barrel filled, a dull rhythm as steady as waves striking shore. This was not work of excitement, but of necessity. Salted fish lasted through winters, traveled to distant markets, and paid rents owed to lords. Without it, villages would starve. And yet, to the people themselves, the process was crushing in its sameness. They salted because they had salted yesterday, and they salted because they would salt again tomorrow. Their world was not measured by progress, but by repetition. Each barrel identical to the one before. The air around the salting sheds was thick with monotony. The sharp sting of salt hung on the wind, mingling with the ever-present odor of fish. Workers grew so accustomed to it that they scarcely noticed, but strangers visiting from inland wrinkled their noses. For villagers, the smell was not foul or strange. It was simply constant, part of life, no different than the sound of gulls overhead or the crash of surf beyond. Conversations around the barrels mirrored the work itself. Short phrases, half-formed jokes, muttered complaints, all repeated endlessly. One woman cursed the way salt cracked her skin. Another laughed, recalling how her grandmother had said the same words in the same spot years before. The repetition of words matched the repetition of motions, until even speech became another cycle, dull and predictable. Children, too, were drawn into the process. Small hands carried handfuls of salt, dropped fish into layers, or swept up the scraps left behind. Their laughter at first seemed lively, but over time even their play echoed the same work. They mimicked the gestures of their parents, learning through monotony what their futures would hold. By adolescence, their laughter had quieted into the same rhythm of salted labor. Absorbed without resistance, the records of markets show how little variety existed. 50 barrels salted herring, 20 barrels cod, 10 barrels mixed fish. The entries are terse, almost mechanical. For every year, the same numbers appear, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but always the same in form. What mattered was not the difference, but the sameness, the knowledge that salt and fish would meet again and again, without change. Thus, Salting was not merely a task. It was a way of life, binding the village to the ocean's dull rhythm. Each grain of salt, each fish layered in brine, carried forward the monotony that defined survival. The barrels stood like monuments to sameness, proof that endurance, not adventure, was the true story of the sea. If fish and salt formed the lifeblood of the coastal village, ropes were its sinews. Without them, boats could not sail, nets could not hold, barrels could not be bound. Rope-making was not glamorous, nor was it rare. It was ordinary, dull, and endlessly necessary. Every strand twisted, every fiber spun, every coil wrapped in circles of monotony that tied the village to the sea as tightly as any knot. The work began with hemp or flax, dried and combed until the fibers lay straight. Workers stretched them out across long paths, sometimes hundreds of feet, and walked back and forth, twisting as they moved. Their feet wore grooves into the ground, their bodies bending in the same rhythm each day. The rope walk, as it was called, echoed with the scrape of shoes, the creak of twisting frames, and the low hum of men repeating motions so practiced that their muscles moved without thought. The sound was dull, but constant. Hands rubbed fibers together, palms burning with friction, until strands thickened into cords. 3 cords became a rope, twisted again and again, the cycle repeating until hundreds of feet of rough hemp lay coiled on the floor. Nothing about the process changed. It was the same this morning as it had been last month, the same this year as it had been for centuries. Rope was not invention, but endurance, an artifact of patience more than creativity. The ropes themselves carried sameness. Coiled in stacks, they looked identical, their rough brown fibers stiff with tar. They smelled sharp and heavy, the scent of preservation that clung to every boat and shed. A sailor could grab any rope and feel the same coarse bite against his hands, no matter where it had been made. To look upon them was to see monotony given form, circles within circles, coiled endlessly, without beginning or end. Rope-makers rarely spoke of pride. Their labor was invisible, vanishing into ships that sailed, nets that hauled, barrels that held. Their names were not remembered, their hands not celebrated. Only the ropes endured, yet even they were temporary, fraying and breaking under the sea's strain, demanding replacement. The cycle of twisting, coiling, repairing never ended. A rope's life was dull, and so was the life of the one who made it. Children, too, joined in this work. They carried bundles of fiber, fetched tar, and practiced small knots. Their laughter rang briefly across the rope walk, but the rhythm soon caught them as well. By adulthood, they had learned the same motions, inherited the same monotony. In rope as in salt, the ocean's dullness wound itself into their lives. Thus, rope-making bound not only boats, but people, to sameness. Each fiber twisted into another, each coil mirrored the last, until the entire village was knotted into a cycle as tight as the ropes they produced. In the story of the sea, even the strongest ties were made of monotony. Generational repetition was perhaps the dullest truth of all coastal life. What one man endured, his son endured after him, and his grandson after that. The ocean offered no new paths, no fresh opportunities. It was not a place of change but of inheritance, where tasks passed down like heirlooms, not because they were cherished, but because they were unavoidable. The father salted fish, so the son salted fish. The mother mended nets, so the daughter mended nets. The work repeated, not only across days, but across lifetimes. A child's earliest memories were shaped by monotony. The sound of gulls crying overhead, the slap of waves against the shore, the smell of fish laid out in rows, these formed the background of every waking moment. Children played with scraps of rope, imitated their parents by pretending to haul imaginary nets, and copied the same dull motions that adulthood would demand of them. Play was not escape, but practice, preparing them for cycles they could not avoid. As they grew, They entered the rhythm without resistance. Boys followed their fathers to the boats, learning how to row, how to cast, how to haul. Their muscles ached in the same places, their hands toughened with the same calluses, their backs bent to the same oars. Girls learned from their mothers to salt fish, patch clothing, and mend nets. They learned to carry baskets heavy with brine, to scrub huts that never lost the smell of tar, to endure sameness with patience. What had been games became duties, and the circle closed without pause. Marriage brought no new story. A fisherman's daughter wed another fisherman's son, their lives merging into the same dull pattern. The wedding feast might hold laughter, but the morning after carried the same nets, the same barrels, the same chores. Children soon followed, and with them the cycle began again. The family tree grew taller, but each branch bore the same fruit. Lives lived in quiet repetition. Bound to the sea, old age offered little difference. Elders sat by the shore, their eyes dim, but their memories filled with routines too similar to distinguish. They might tell stories of storms or poor harvests, but even those tales sounded alike, blending into a chorus of sameness. Their final years were spent watching children repeat the same tasks they had performed in youth. The same motions played again like a song with no end. Death itself was less a conclusion than a pause in the cycle, soon filled by another hand at the oar, another back bent to the barrel. Thus, coastal life was not a story of progress, but of inheritance. Each generation lived the same dull days, performed the same dull chores, endured the same dull sea. To be born by the ocean was to be born into its monotony, a life written not in chapters, but in circles. The ocean's presence was not only seen in nets or barrels, but also heard and smelled, its monotony carried into every sense. For those who lived beside it, the sound of the sea was constant, so steady that it became invisible to the mind. Waves rolled against the shore with a rhythm as fixed as breathing. They crashed, hissed, retreated, and then returned again, each one identical to the last. To a visitor, the noise might seem calming or dramatic. To the villagers, it was simply background, so familiar that silence would have felt strange. At night, the same rhythm lulled people to sleep. Children dozed to the faint roar of surf. Mothers worked by firelight while the tide whispered in the distance. Old men muttered their prayers to a soundtrack of waves. The sound was always there, and always the same. If a storm came, the sea roared louder, but even its anger repeated in cycles, as though the waves themselves grew bored of change. Calm or wild, the ocean sang only one song, endless, repetitive, unchanging. The calls of gulls added another note, sharp and constant. They circled the shore in great flocks, their cries slicing through the air from dawn to dusk. Fishermen ignored them, for they had cried the same yesterday, and they would cry the same tomorrow. The gulls mirrored the fishermen themselves, repeating their flights, their calls, their endless search for scraps. In time, their voices blended into the monotony of the waves, until both together became a single dull chorus. Even the creak of wood was repetitive. Boats, huts, and rope all groaned under the pressure of salt and weather. The sounds were never new. The same moan of a beam settling, the same squeak of a rope pulled tight, the same splash of water striking planks. Life beside the sea was filled with noises, but none surprised, none broke the rhythm. They were as predictable as the sunrise, as forgettable as breath. The smells were no different. Salt filled the air, sharp and clean at first, but over time so constant that it faded into background. Fish added their sour weight, barrels reeked of brine, and huts carried the smell of smoke clinging to damp walls. Tar seeped into everything, coating hands, staining clothing, soaking into rope. A visitor might gag, but the villagers noticed none of it. To them, it was not smell. It was simply life. Thus, the ocean invaded the senses, not with variety, but with repetition. Its sounds and smells became so constant that they ceased to register, shaping lives without thought. To hear waves was to hear nothing new. To smell fish was to smell nothing different. Every day offered the same chorus, the same perfume, the same monotony. The sea entered ears and noses as predictably as it entered nets, dull and endless, the sensory echo of survival. If the sound of the sea dulled the ear, the smell of it dulled the nose. From the moment one stepped into a coastal village, the air was thick with odors that never shifted. Salt hung everywhere, sharp and biting, clinging to skin and clothing. It drifted from the sea spray, coated the walls of huts, soaked into wooden barrels. At first, the scent seemed fresh, even invigorating. But to those who lived with it, the sharpness faded into monotony. Salt was not a smell anymore. It was the atmosphere itself. Unnoticed because it was constant. Fish layered their own presence on top of salt, and theirs was not a scent easily ignored. Freshly caught fish gave off a faint briny sweetness, but once salted, dried, or stored, the odor grew sour and heavy. It seeped into floors, baskets, and hands, marking everything it touched. Villagers carried it with them wherever they went, so much so that outsiders often remarked on the staleness of their clothing. To the villagers, however, it was not foul. It was simply familiar, a smell so constant that its absence would have been unsettling. Tar added another note, thick and sticky, used to coat ropes and sailboats. It burned into the nostrils with a resinous weight. The smell clung to hands that twisted hemp into cords. 2 sails patched in the yard, 2 planks freshly sealed against the sea. Workers reeked of it, though they ceased to notice. For them, tar was as ordinary as air, its harshness dulled by years of exposure, where strangers might wrinkle their noses. Locals walked on without thought. The combination of salt, fish, and tar filled every corner of village life. Huts smelled of brine-soaked floors. Pathways carried the tang of drying nets. Storage sheds exhaled the sourness of stacked barrels. Even churchyards, far from the beach, could not escape the ocean's perfume. When the wind shifted inland, it carried the whole village with it, spreading the dull sameness of smell across fields and farms. Children were born into this monotony of scent. Their first breaths were laced with salt and fish, their childhood play stained with tar. To them, it was not strange, but normal. They smelled their parents' clothing, their food, their very skin, and all of it carried the same familiar weight. When they grew older and traveled inland, some felt disoriented by the absence of those odors. Silence might unsettle the ear, but odorless air unsettled the nose. Visitors, however, often remarked on the sameness. Merchants complained of fish-scented rooms. Pilgrims groaned about the stench of barrels in taverns. Nobles wrinkled their noses when villagers approached with gifts of salted fish. To outsiders, the smell was intrusive, overwhelming. To villagers, it was invisible, part of existence. Thus, the ocean's dullness extended beyond sight and sound into the realm of smell. Salt, fish, and tar bound themselves into the very air, forming a constant that endured across years and lifetimes. The village breathed monotony, carrying the ocean in every breath. When the same sounds and smells filled every moment, they shaped not only the senses, but also the mind. Monotony pressed itself into thought, narrowing what villagers dreamed, what sailors expected, what children grew to believe life should be. Sensory sameness became mental sameness. To live with the sea was not only to endure its cycles of work, but to carry its dull rhythm inside one's head. The sound of waves, for instance, dulled reflection. At first a visitor might find the crash and retreat soothing, even inspiring, but for those who heard it every hour of every day, it melted into background noise. Silence did not exist. Only waves existed, and because they never stopped, they vanished from notice. A man might walk the beach and hear nothing at all, though the water roared at his feet. In time, his mind adopted the same rhythm, steady, repetitive, without surprise. His thoughts flowed like waves, circling, returning, repeating. Smell worked in the same way. The temps of salt, the sourness of fish, the heaviness of turtle, constant, all inescapable. For the people of the coast, these scents did not spark memory or desire. They offered no variety, no freshness, no sudden delight. Instead, they dulled imagination. To dream of food was to dream of bread, not fish. To dream of air was to dream of mountains, not salt. The monotony of scent narrowed possibilities until only absence felt extraordinary. This sensory sameness also shaped emotion. Joy rarely came from the sea's presence, because its presence was constant. Instead, joy arose only when something interrupted it, when a storm broke the silence of calm, when a strange smell drifted from a merchant's goods, when gulls fell quiet for a time. These small variations became remarkable only because they broke the ocean's monotony. The ordinary was invisible. Only difference stood out. Patience, too, was born of sameness. Fishermen endured hours at sea because the waves taught them how to endure. Families endured long winters because the smell of salt and fish reminded them that life was built on repetition. Children endured long days of chores because monotony itself had trained them for it. Sensory dullness became a lesson in survival, an education in waiting, a practice in living without novelty. Yet the same monotony could weigh heavily. Some felt trapped by it, their minds restless with a hunger for difference. A young man might dream of a distant city, less because he desired riches than because he longed for smells and sounds that were not the same. A girl might imagine fields of flowers, not for beauty, but for the relief of scent that was not salt or fish. The ocean's constancy pressed them to seek change, even as it bound them in cycles they could not escape. Thus, the monotony of sound and smell became more than background, it became the texture of thought itself. The sea entered ears and noses, but it also entered minds, shaping people into reflections of its own dull endurance. To modern ears and noses, the monotony of the medieval coast might seem unbearable. The endless crash of waves, the sharpness of salt, the heaviness of fish and tarthies would overwhelm a visitor unaccustomed to such sameness. Yet strangely, when described from afar, this dull sensory world feels soothing. What once dulled the minds of villagers now calms the minds of those who live in a world filled with too much change, too much noise, too much variety. The monotony of the sea has become, in memory, a form of peace. Think of the waves. For the fishermen, they were so constant as to vanish from notice, a background without value. For the modern listener, lying in bed or drifting into sleep, those same waves are a lullaby. Their rhythm is steady, predictable, safe. They rise and fall without drama, repeat without end, and in that repetition lies comfort. What dulled the mind of the sailor soothes the mind of the restless sleeper. The smells, too, though heavy and unpleasant in life, transform in memory. Salt, once biting and invasive, becomes the scent of freshness in the imagination of those far from shore. Fish, once overwhelming, is forgotten, leaving behind only the idea of the sea's presence. Tar, once sticky and harsh, fades into the suggestion of wood and ships and distant travel. What was once monotony becomes, across time, an essence of calmness, a faint perfume of history. Even the dull sounds of gulls, once irritating in their endless cries, can be a distant gull's call across a quiet harbor feels atmospheric, almost romantic, when heard by someone who does not live with it every day. What exhausted villagers now comforts outsiders, precisely because it is not constant anymore. The monotony, broken by distance, becomes a chosen sound, not an inescapable one. For listeners today, imagining this sensory monotony can serve as a balm. To picture waves repeating, to hear gulls calling, to imagine the sharp temps of salt in the air is to step into a world where nothing changes, where no surprises wait, where life flows in circles. In a restless world, Such monotony is rare, even desirable. The dullness of the past becomes, for us, the calm of the present. This is why so many seek the ocean's sounds in recordings, why they play waves and gulls as they sleep. It is why salt air is bottled as a fragrance, why the smell of tar and wood is folded into candles and oils. The monotony that once crushed now soothes. The cycles that once dulled now comfort. What the medieval villager endured, we embrace. Thus, the dull sensory life of the coast, when remembered now, becomes not burden, but blessing. Its sounds and smells, stripped of hardship, remain only as repetition. And repetition, to those seeking calm, is no longer monotony, it is peace. Stories of the sea often speak of monsters, spirits, and wonders, but for the people who lived with the ocean daily, even legends became dull in the telling. Fishermen repeated tales, not as grand adventures, but as ordinary warnings, softened by routine. A story told too many times, like a wave breaking too often on the same shore, lost its sharpness. What survived was not terror or wonder, but monotony, dressed as myth. One such tale was that of the sea serpent. Travelers spoke of a great creature, long as a ship and fierce as a storm. Its scales glistened, its eyes glowed, its coils could wrap around a vessel and drag it down. But when the tale reached the village, it was stripped of drama. A fisherman might mutter over his net, "There are serpents in the deep, they say." Another might nod and reply, but I've never seen one." And then they returned to mending, their hands moving, their voices flat. The serpent became less a monster than a phrase, something to fill silence before the next knot was tied. The same was true of mermaids. Where poets sang of beauty and danger, coastal people spoke of them with shrugs. They sing, they say, lure men to drown. Yet no man in the tavern claimed to hear such a song. At most, a sailor might half joke that a mermaid stole his missing sock or soured his water barrel. The legend flattened into humor, its edges dulled by repetition until it became another way to complain about the sea's monotony. Even storms, which might have felt terrifying in their moment, became legends retold with surprising dullness. The mast cracked, a sailor would say. We tied it back with rope. Lost a barrel. Others nodded, adding their own versions. Waves high, nearly tipped. Yet the words lacked drama. They repeated the same patterns, recorded in logs with the same lifeless tone, told in taverns with the same weary voice. The storm, in memory, became not a moment of terror, but another entry in the long cycle of sameness. Children heard these tales, but they learned quickly that they were not to be feared, only endured. They repeated them as they patched nets or salted fish, the stories blending with labor until they felt no different from a list of chores. Legends were not escapes from dullness. They were absorbed into dullness, stripped of life, folded into the monotony of sea-bound existence. Thus, the legends of the sea did not dazzle those who lived with it. They did not shiver at serpents or swoon at mermaids. They nodded, muttered, and continued their work. The ocean's greatest myths became background noise, like waves and gulls always present, always repeated, never new. The sea itself dulled its own stories, turning wonders into routines, marvels into murmurs. Fishermen were practical men. They did not have the luxury of dwelling on monsters or spirits when their days were filled with the unchanging tasks of nets and barrels. If a tale of a sea serpent drifted through the tavern, it was met with the same shrug as a comment about the weather. "Perhaps it's out there," one man would mutter, eyes half closed from fatigue. But serpent or no serpent, these nets won't mend themselves. The legend ended there, swallowed by the dull rhythm of necessity. For those who spent every day on the water, the sea was not mysterious. It was ordinary. They did not see depths as hidden kingdoms, or waves as veils for magical creatures. They saw fish, rope, and wood. To them, the ocean did not glitter with wonder. It smelled of salt and rot. It groaned against planks. It wore out boots and hands. A fisherman knew that what threatened him most was not a monster rising from the deep, but a frayed rope or an empty net. Legends were distractions, and distractions had no place in a life that repeated the same cycles without end. The few times a sailor tried to dress the sea with wonder, others laughed. A mermaid sang to me, one might boast. Another would shake his head and reply, she must have been tired. Then I heard nothing but gulls. The laughter was half-hearted, dulled by repetition. Men had heard the same joke before, perhaps dozens of times. Mermaids became not temptresses of lore, but excuses for poor catches, a dull punchline to fill the silence between mugs of ale. Even when storms stirred stories, the focus was never on monsters. A man describing a violent night at sea did not speak of creatures lurking in the waves. He spoke of rope that snapped, of sails that tore, of barrels that rolled loose. The terror of drowning was not clothed in myth, but in the sameness of material failure. The mast cracked, they would say, the phrase as plain as the ink in ship logs. Their fear was real in the moment, but the retelling stripped it bare, turning danger into another line in an endless record of the sea's dullness. Children absorbed this attitude early. They heard of serpents and mermaids in whispers, but when they asked questions, their fathers dismissed them with weary sighs. No monsters here, only fish, they would say, guiding small hands to patch nets or scrape scales. The lesson was clear. Legends did not mend holes, salt fish, or feed families. The ocean was not to be imagined, it was to be endured. Thus, myths shrank under the weight of monotony. Fishermen did not deny them, but they did not care. The sea's dull demands erased awe, leaving only the rhythm of labor. Where poets dreamed of monsters, villagers salted fish. Where travelers whispered of spirits, sailors rode in silence. The ocean's myths withered, ignored by those too busy repeating the same tasks to be enchanted. Not all sea legends spoke of monsters. Many told of spirits, restless souls drifting across the waves, voices carried in the wind, or faint lights glowing above the water at night. Yet even these stories, meant to stir fear or reverence, became dulled by repetition. Fishermen passed them along in flat tones, as if they were little more than chores spoken aloud. The sea, after all, left little room for wonder. It demanded nets be cast, barrels filled, and ropes tied. Spirits, if they existed, did nothing to change the work. One common tale told of drowned sailors who returned as whispering voices. On still nights, men claimed to hear faint murmurs carried across the water, but instead of shivering with awe, they used the legend as explanation for ordinary sounds. The sea talks, they would say, shrugging. It says nothing new. To them, the whispers were not warnings or omens. They were background noise, no different than the creak of wood or the call of gulls. Another tale spoke of ghostly light swallow, the wisps that drifted above the waves. Travelers described them as spirits guiding or deceiving sailors. But in coastal villages, the story shrank into dull practicality. Sometimes you see a light, a man would mutter while patching a net. Might be a lantern, might be nothing. The explanation ended there. The glow, once imagined as magic, became as unremarkable as the moon. A child might ask, "What do the lights mean?" And the answer, given with a tired sigh, was always the same. They mean it's night. Even omens of bad luck lost their power in this monotony. A gull landing on a boat might once have been taken as a sign of death, but fishermen grew too familiar with gulls to care. Birds come, birds go, they said, we still row. The same was true for other superstitions, knots tied the wrong way, dreams of drowning, the sight of strange shadows. Each might stir curiosity for a moment, but routine quickly smothered it. The fish still needed catching. The nets still needed mending. No spirit changed the cycle. Generations repeated the legends, but their retellings became more anticlimactic with time. Grandparents whispered of sea spirits, parents repeated the words half-heartedly, and children listened without fear. By adulthood, they understood what the stories really were, ways to fill silence during long hours of dull work. Legends became not beliefs, but distractions, worn smooth by countless retellings, until they held no more weight than a sigh. Thus, the spirits of the sea became reflections of the ocean itself, present, repeated, and dull. They drifted through memory like waves, always returning, never changing, never surprising. Where once they might have sparked awe, they now served only as background to the greater monotony of survival. The sea spirits, like its sounds and smells, blended into sameness. They did not haunt the people, they bored them. If there was one thing more monotonous than the sea legends themselves, it was the way they ended. Tales that should have finished with dread or awe almost always closed with laughter, shrugs, or silence. Fishermen had little appetite for drama. Their lives were filled with sameness, and even their stories learned to follow the same dull path. Where a traveler might expect tension, a villager delivered anticlimax. Consider the story of the giant squid. Sailors claimed to see long tentacles rising from the water, curling around boats, dragging ships into the deep. In another place, the tale might have grown into terror, but in the taverns of coastal villages, it ended differently. A squid, big as the mast, a sailor would mutter, "We beat it off with oars." Another man would nod, sip his ale, and say, "Still had to mend the net." Laughter followed, not fear. The monster dissolved into routine, its terror swallowed by the sameness of daily work. The same flattening happened with ghost stories. A man swore he heard voices at night, whispers rising from the waves. His companions leaned closer, but his next words always deflated the tension. They said nothing worth hearing. The table erupted in chuckles. The legend ended not with chills, but with the dull humor of men too weary to take mystery seriously. To them, ghosts did not threaten. They bored. Even mermaids, once creatures of beauty and danger, became jokes. She sang to me, one sailor teased, but her song was off-key. Another replied, "Better off than my wife's singing." The men laughed, shook their heads, and went back to their mugs. What might have been a tale of enchantment turned into a tired jest. The legend's weight was lost. Its ending collapsed into repetition and humor. This anticlimax reflected more than weariness. It revealed how deeply monotony shaped their lives. The ocean dulled not only the senses, but also the stories told about it. Drama could not survive in a place where every day repeated the last. Fear faded because danger itself was routine. A storm was frightening in the moment, but once endured, it became just another line in a log. Another story told flatly, another tale that ended with a shrug. Children learned this lesson early. They listened with wide eyes as grandparents began tales of serpents or spirits, only to hear the endings trail into anticlimax. Excitement gave way to sighs, and fear gave way to laughter. They grew up expecting stories to fizzle, not to frighten. Legends became part of the dull rhythm of life, woven into the same cycles as salting fish or mending nets. Thus, the legends of the sea, retold in coastal villages, lost their sharp edges. They did not rise to climaxes or carry weighty endings. They ended flat, with a shrug, a chuckle, or silence. The ocean itself demanded no conclusion, only repetition. Its myths reflected that truth, dissolving into anticlimax, mirroring the dullness that defined all life by the water's edge. When we step back from the lives of fishermen, clerks, villagers, and sailors, one truth emerges with clarity. The ocean's greatest legacy in history was its dullness. It was not the stage of endless adventure that songs and poems suggest, but a backdrop of repetition that shaped millions of ordinary lives. Every net cast, every barrel salted, every record written, every voyage endured, all of it added up not to drama, but to monotony. The sea was not extraordinary. It was ordinary, and in that ordinariness lay its power. For the people who lived beside it, the ocean did not inspire wonder. It was too constant, too demanding, too repetitive. It swallowed their senses until they could not hear waves or smell salt without forgetting they were even there. It demanded labor that never varied, meals that never changed, nights that never differed from those before. It stripped legends of their flattened stories into jokes, dulled memory until one year felt like the next. This was not an ocean of discovery, but an ocean of survival, steady, repetitive, and plain, and yet, in this dullness was stability. The ocean fed villages, carried trade, filled records, shaped cultures. Its monotony provided the foundation on which entire societies rested. Without the sameness of fish, families would have starved. Without the sameness of ropes, ships would have failed. Without the sameness of logs, merchants would have lost their order. The very dullness that crushed imagination built endurance. What was boring was also what was essential. Seen from our modern distance, this legacy has a strange beauty. We are surrounded by change, by noise, by endless novelty. To imagine a world where life moved in cycles so steady, so predictable, feels almost calming. The fisherman casting the same net, the clerk writing the same line, the sailor waiting under the same stars. These images, once monotonous, now carry a rhythm that soothes. The dullness of the past becomes the lull of the present. But it is important to remember that for those who lived it, the monotony was not peaceful. It was wearying. It pressed into bodies, bent backs, cracked hands, dulled minds. They endured it not because they found it calming, but because they had no choice. The ocean gave them no escape. Its cycles bound them as surely as nets bound fish. They lived their lives repeating the same motions until death itself seemed less like an end than a pause before the next generation continued the same dull work. This is the true legacy of the ocean, not monsters, not heroes, but monotony. It shapes societies quietly, without grandeur, without climax. It was not thrilling, but it was enduring, and in its endurance, it carried humanity across centuries. The monotony of the sea was more than a condition of life, it was survival itself. To outsiders, the sameness of nets, meals, and records might seem crushing, but for those who depended on the ocean, repetition was security. If the catch was predictable, the village ate. If the rope held, the ship sailed. If the clerk's tally matched the barrels, the market remained stable. What seemed dull was, in fact, the assurance that tomorrow would mirror today, and in a world where famine, war, and disease struck without warning, such sameness was a kind of blessing. The fisherman who rose before dawn did not hope for novelty. He hoped for the same shoal of herring that had come last week, and the week before. The family who salted fish did not dream of new flavors. They longed for the same barrels filled in the same way, guaranteeing food through the long winter. The sailor did not wish for strange horizons each morning. He prayed only for steady winds, calm seas, and routines that promised he would return alive. To survive, the ocean had to be boring. Adventure, in truth, was dangerous. Surprise meant storms, shipwrecks, or failed catches. Novelty meant risk, and risk threatened the fragile balance of coastal life. To live with the sea was to distrust change. Families relied on sameness because it was the only path to endurance. A dull day was a safe day, and safety was what allowed children to grow, elders to endure, and villages to remain. Excitement was for poets. Monotony was for survival. Even the records, so lifeless to modern readers, reveal this truth. Each line of wind moderate or 50 barrels herring was reassurance. It meant the ship had not sunk. It meant the nets had not failed. It meant life continued. The boredom of the ink was, in its time, a quiet triumph. It told of a cycle unbroken, of hunger avoided, of another season endured. The sameness of the words reflected the sameness of survival itself. We often imagine history as a chain of extraordinary moments, conquests, discoveries, disasters, but for most who lived by the sea, history was the absence of events. To endure one more day without storm, to fill one more barrel without spoilage, to write one more line without error, this was their achievement. Their legacy was not change, but continuity. The sea shaped them into people who valued the predictable, who found safety in repetition, who endured boredom because boredom kept them alive. Thus, the monotony of the ocean was not only the dull truth of daily life, it was the framework of survival. Adventure might belong to stories, but sameness belonged to reality. Without it, coastal life would have collapsed. With it, generations endured, carrying forward a rhythm as steady as the tide. The sea's monotony was not just endured, it was embraced, because it was the very foundation of existence. The dullness of the sea did more than shape daily routines. Over time, it became the foundation of cultures and traditions. Repetition seeped into festivals, prayers, and customs until the very identity of coastal communities was tied to monotony. What the ocean provided in sameness, people carried into ritual, passing it on through generations as though the rhythm of the tide had woven itself into their bones. Festivals, for example, celebrated the same events year after year. Villagers gathered at the same season to bless the boats, to pray for fish, to thank the sea for its steady bounty. The words of the prayers barely changed from one century to the next. The dances followed the same steps, the songs repeated the same verses. These rituals, while intended to honor the sea, were reflections of it, predictable, familiar, comforting. Excitement was brief, but sameness endured. To participate was to feel part of a cycle larger than oneself, a rhythm stretching backward and forward across time. Traditions of food echoed this monotony. Families prepared the same dishes, with salted fish, served the same way, at the same times of year. Fasts, feasts, and holy days were marked not by novelty, but by repetition. Cod on Fridays, herring during Lent, barrels opened in winter. Generations ate from the same barrels, spoke the same blessings, repeated the same motions of chewing and swallowing, until tradition itself tasted of sameness. It was not variety that gave meaning, but continuity. Even storytelling became part of the monotony. Legends of spirits, monsters, or storms were told and retold, their details worn smooth by endless repetition. Children heard the same tales their grandparents had told, and when they grew, they passed them on again. The stories were not meant to surprise. They were meant to connect, to reinforce the sameness of the sea's presence. Just as waves returned, so did the words, circling endlessly, without conclusion. Customs of work mirrored this cultural rhythm. Fathers taught sons the same knots, the same rowing techniques, the same ways to salt fish. Mothers taught daughters the same stitches, the same songs to hum while mending, the same careful order of tasks. Work became tradition, and tradition became identity. To change was unthinkable, because survival itself depended on sameness. In this way, the monotony of the sea echoed through every gesture of life. What might seem stifling to us gave those communities stability. The repetition of rituals bound them together, provided meaning where variety was absent. The dullness of daily life became a form of heritage. Each generation looked backward and saw itself reflected in the ones before. Each looked forward and knew the rhythm would continue. The sea was not just background, it was the model for culture itself, steady, predictable, dull, but enduring. Thus, the ocean's monotony was not only survival, it became tradition, memory, and culture. The dull cycles of the sea wrote themselves into the dull cycles of human life, binding people not only to survival, but to identity. In the end, The story of the ocean is not one of storms or monsters, but of monotony. Its dull rhythm shaped lives so completely that generations passed within it, barely noticing its weight. Waves rolled in, nets were cast, fish salted, ropes twisted, records written, and the cycle repeated without end. The sea did not ask for imagination, it asked for endurance, and humanity gave it, century after century, until repetition itself became our quiet inheritance. This inheritance is not dramatic, but it is powerful. The sameness of the sea taught people how to live through scarcity, how to accept routine, how to find meaning in stability rather than change. The monotony trained them to value continuity over excitement, patience over novelty. The ocean's dullness seeped into memory, shaping cultures where repetition was ritual, where cycles of food and labor became tradition, where stories were told not for surprise but for comfort. Even now, when most of us no longer live at the mercy of the tide, the legacy of that monotony remains. We still seek rhythm in our days, still cling to routines that mirror the cycles of waves. We set meals at the same times, follow calendars with repeated holidays, tell stories passed down through generations. Though we may not salt barrels of herring or row against gray horizons, we still live within patterns shaped long ago by the sea's dull constancy. And yet, viewed from today, what once felt heavy can seem soothing. For those who endured it, the sameness of the ocean was wariness. For us, imagining it from a distance, the sameness feels calming. To hear waves repeat, to picture gulls circling, to imagine salt air filling every breath, is to step into a world stripped of chaos, where nothing changes, where nothing intrudes. The monotony that once bound lives now promises peace to restless minds. It is here, perhaps, that the ocean's dullest truth finds its quiet beauty. What bored the villagers, what numbed the fishermen, what wearied the clerks, can lull us into rest. The cycles that drained imagination then can ease exhaustion now. The ocean's story, told without climax, becomes a bedtime rhythm, the creak of a rope, the hiss of a wave, the whisper of a gull. Nothing changes, nothing surprises him. In that nothingness lies comfort. So the ocean leaves us with this paradox. Its greatest legacy is not adventure, but boredom. And yet, in boredom, we find survival. In boredom, we find tradition. And in boredom, retold as history, we find rest. The dull sea that sustained countless lives long ago still sustains us now, not with food or trade, but with the calm reminder that sameness, too, has its place. Close your eyes, then, hear the waves roll in, again and again. They bring no monsters, no treasures, no storms, only themselves, returning endlessly, as they always have, as they always will.